Good morning, Jeff.
Well, this seems to indicate that the development of income inequality really grew in a most massive way during the period of the 84 Labour government.
It certainly did grow during the late 1980s and the early 1990s. What it also shows is that through the 9 years of the fifth Labour government, actually we started to turn that trend around. What I'm worried about, Jeff, is that, of course, the opposite has happened in the last couple of years. We've seen more unemployment, many more people on benefits. We've seen tax cuts that have given hundreds of dollars a week, sometimes thousands of dollars a week to the very wealthy, while the people on low and middle incomes have actually missed out.
But this report does say that the middle income people, the disparity was in fact addressed during that period of the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, and that in fact things have got better.
Well, things have certainly got better under the fifth Labour government, and you saw the number of things that happened there. The minimum wage regularly adjusted upwards, 350,000 jobs created, a lot of investment in early childhood education to develop the human capital that the OECD reports on. You had working for families that made a big difference there, so that you started to get a fairer go. And it's not absolute equality that you're after; it's about equality of opportunity. And the worrying thing in this report is that it says that as New Zealand moved to have an even wider gap between rich and poor, you started to see less social mobility, less equality of opportunity. And certainly what the current government is doing and what it's foreshadowing now is going to make that situation worse.
But governments, going back to when you were in the Longy government in the 84 all the way through, have been banging on about having to upskill the workforce, got to get more technologically better, we've got to get people who have better skills and so on. It's been a constant refrain. It doesn't seem to have happened.
Well, it certainly did happen under the fifth Labour government, but that's all history. I mean, what we were talking about at the last election is, I think, relevant to the OECD report. That's why we were talking about raising the minimum wage to $15, because what I've been finding as I've gone around food banks and other places is that the people going in for help now aren't simply people on benefits. They're working poor, people not being paid enough to enable them to put proper food on the table for their kids, to meet their rent and their power costs and so on. We talked about raising the top tax rate precisely because the wealthiest people in the country were getting thousands of dollars a week in tax cuts, while people at the other end of the scale and middle-income people were being squeezed.
But you were bringing in Working for Families, which was targeting those people and helping those people, wasn't it?
Well, Working for Families did that under the last Labour government. We were talking about getting some balance back into the system after tax cuts that put GST on everybody, and that hurts those who consume all of their income most. That's lower income people. And people on the top rate, most cabinet ministers got hundreds of dollars a week, the Prime Minister $1,000 a week in tax cuts. Where is the equity in that when we know the rich are getting richer and the rest of the country is falling further behind? So we would have reversed that for the top 2%, those earning over $150,000. But we also had major programs that would have addressed the need to upskill New Zealanders. That's why we talked about turning the dole into an apprenticeship for 18 and 19-year-olds, giving kids the skills that would enable them to have a decent earning potential right throughout their lives. Now, this government hasn't put enough emphasis on that, and would continue to push for that.
A report by the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development has found that among developed countries, New Zealand experienced one of the fastest increases in the gap between rich and poor from 1985 to 2008. The report says more needs to be done to raise skill levels, and it suggests the rich should be taxed more heavily. Finance Minister Bill English told Morning Report the greatest factors in the equation are the availability of jobs and a growing economy.
With respect to taxes, the thing that makes the biggest difference here is when the tax system is unfair and there's too many holes in it. In recent years, in fact over the last 15 years or so, New Zealand governments of both colours have done a reasonable amount to tidy that up. And we did a big tidy up back in 2010 where people have to actually pay the statutory tax rate because they weren't doing that. It's all very fine having high top tax rates, but IRD, for instance, found that most of New Zealand's wealthiest taxpayers simply didn't pay it.
The outgoing Labour leader Phil Goff says he's worried that the gains his party has made to close the gap have been eroded by National's policies.
We've seen more unemployment, many more people on benefits, We've seen tax cuts that have given hundreds of dollars a week, sometimes thousands of dollars a week to the very wealthy, while the people on low and middle incomes have actually missed out.
Annalena Nozal is spokesperson for the OECD. She co-authored the report and told me that globally the current gap between rich and poor is the widest in 3 decades, and there's little sign of the New Zealand tax system helping to close it.
What the report shows is that the gap between the rich and the poor is at its highest point in the last 30 years at the OECD. The rich are now paying less taxes than 30 years ago, and the benefits that are going to the poor, they have not kept up with increasing wages over the last 30 years.
And when you look specifically at New Zealand, during that period, we've introduced a broad-based consumption tax, which we didn't have before, as well as making changes to income tax. Has consumption tax made a difference?
Well, what we see for New Zealand is that inequality was below the OECD average in the mid-80s and is now slightly above the OECD average. And it has actually seen one of the highest increases in inequality in the OECD. At the same time, the increase in inequality was mainly between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s, and since then it has remained relatively flat. And here there are several explanations. As you mentioned, the tax issue is one of them. But we were thinking that the consumption tax, but particularly the changes in personal income tax have made a difference. Because when we see the top marginal tax share, it has declined from 66% in the 1980s to 33%.
So when we thought that making the rich richer by giving them or making them pay less tax would trickle down and help those lower paid in the economy, it hasn't worked.
No, it has not worked. What the OECD report shows for New Zealand, as for many OECD countries, is that growth doesn't not necessarily trickle down to the bottom of the income distribution, and particularly what we see in many countries, and New Zealand is one of them, is that the share of the top 1%, the richest 1%, has increased dramatically from 6%. In 1980 to 9% in the mid 2000s.
There's been a determined attempt here to target benefits at those who need them. Is that reflected in your statistics?
Well, we have not looked closely at New Zealand in those changes, but what we have seen is that the changes in benefits, they have two components. One is how targeted they are, and the other one is the overall size. And what we see is that for New Zealand, they have definitely become more targeted, yet at the same time, because the rates were cut at the beginning of the 1990s, they are reaching overall lower proportion in terms of spending than in the OECD, and therefore they are less redistributive on average.
That's Annalena Nozal, a spokesperson for the OECD and co-author of the new report into the disparity between the rich and the poor. Well, joining us now, the economist Gareth Morgan and the University of Auckland Law Professor Jane Kelsey. Good morning to you both.
Morning.
Gareth Morgan, did Annalena Nozal say anything that surprised you there?
No, not at all. New Zealand has seen a widening disparity of incomes over that 30 years since financial deregulation. There's no doubt about that. If you're looking at income only, then I agree with what they're saying. Most of that occurred during the first decade of financial deregulation. But if you're looking at wealth, then you would get an even more dramatic disparity, growth in the disparity, Jeff. And that's because, of course, over the last decade or more, 1.5 decades, there's been a huge increase in the relative price of housing, the value of housing. And so the property-owning class, if I can characterise us as that, have definitely had a major increase in our wealth, not just our income, but our wealth, relative to the rest.
So this report doesn't look at capital appreciation in that sense, so it doesn't give us a big picture.
Yeah, no, it's only looking at income and after-tax incomes. So when I hear Bill English talking about, cleaning up the gaps in the income regime, absolutely correct, what he's talking about. But you're really only dealing with a small portion of the whole issue. I think New Zealand has got to have a discussion as to, what is the egalitarian New Zealand really about? Do we have a minimum level of income and wealth that we're not prepared to see people fall below? And if we sort of get to that sort of debate, then I think, we can make sense of this whole thing.
Jane Kelsey, can I bring you in here? When I came to New Zealand in 1965, I was told all the time that New Zealand was an egalitarian society. That's a phrase that sort of disappeared, but interesting to hear Gareth Morgan raise it again now, particularly in the light of this report.
Yes, and I think what Gareth's been doing for some time now is trying to generate the discussion that we really need to have. And, it's very interesting to see entities like the OECD starting to change the story that they are telling. I think what's worrying is that even though the language of the 80s and 90s may have changed in terms of government speak, we're seeing pretty much the same policies, and certainly in the National Act coalition agreement in the last couple of days. And I think we need to have that conversation that goes beyond questions of what the level of tax should be. We need to start thinking about how we move forward from here. One of the things that concerns me especially is that we're in a sort of cocoon in New Zealand about the state of the international economy and the nature of crises, and what are we going to do here when the next meltdown happens, when we have a major recession, when we have major job losses, and when we have households, especially the poorest households, with levels of debt and really low income levels that are unsustainable in a situation of crisis.
Because our expectations are too high of the sort of lifestyle that we deserve?
Well, one of the features of the last decade is that whilst the growth in inequality has slowed, we have seen a massive increase in the amount of private debt that households have taken on to make up for the gap in falling real household incomes and the standard of living that in a consumer-driven economy people are encouraged to take on. And so, in a sense, that's unsustainable. And it's one of the things that when Joseph Stiglitz did a report for the UN about the financial crisis, he pointed to the systemic problems of growing inequality in terms of the way that people, both households and governments, have become dependent on debt in what became known as the fire economy.
Trouble is, people's eyes glaze over when you start talk that sort of language.
Well, if you just look at the reality of households, how much debt do our ordinary households have here? Can they sustain that debt? And if the government takes away the kind of safety nets that we've already seen eroded, especially since the early 1990s, and we have a significant increase in job losses, how are we going to move forward? And I think the OECD's report was very useful in highlighting the need for investment in education, in particular for the lower skilled, livable wages and real jobs, as well as redistributive tax and transfers. And
well, let's hope that we've in some small way started the conversation you've both been talking about with society this morning. Thank you for joining us. Economist Gareth Morgan, University of Auckland Law Professor Jane Kelsey.